Preference shaping is a good one, right? So corporate foundations in philanthropy, I'll give you an example there. Okay, somebody who's very, very influential at the moment, who you may have heard of, around policies, whether it's WHO or even in this country, or even funding certain parts of our media, Bill Gates. Did you know the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation heavily invested stocks in the pharmaceutical industry, McDonald's and Coca-Cola? That might be a problem when it comes to unbiased information. Bill Gates is very interested in patents and innovation, that kind of stuff, but he doesn't talk about non-communicable diseases. He doesn't talk about diet or tackling the obesity epidemic. Is that a reason? May well be. Capture of the media. Now, 80% of broadcast print media in the US is owned by about 7 corporations. We have a creeping increase in concern of corporations' influence on the media here. Why is that important? Well, actually, most public opinion, the biggest impact on driver and public opinion is mainstream media. And I found that from conversations at the very highest level, again, of health policymakers. I'll come on to a little story, a little interesting anecdote for you shortly around that. And then they capture the knowledge environment. So you've got science of specification funding medical education, right? And also what they do is the fact that we talked about earlier, it didn't used to be this way. If you go to the 80s and 90s, most university research was publicly funded. Now most of the university research in this country is coming from the drug industry. So those scientists in British institutions, one of the factors is they don't want to bite the hand that feeds them. And even if they won't be proactive and say, hold on a minute, this data is fraudulent or unreliable, they stay silent often, even when they know something's not right. But I would then quote, I would look at it differently. If you're not part of the solution, then you're part of the problem, and there will be no solution. Or even as Mahatma Gandhi, who's one of my inspirations, said, silence becomes cowardice when occasion demands speaking out the whole truth and acting accordingly. But the reason I'm talking about that is it creates that culture, the culture that is anti-human, which is not in our best interest, not for everybody, not for anyone. And then legal environment, so they are protected. Okay, from legal, if they do commit fraud, if there's people even found guilty of fraud within a company, those people are protected because they're doing it in the interest of the company. And then the extra legal environment, something I've also experienced myself, is one of the things is opposition fragmentation. So what they do is, and they do it in very subtle ways, they will target public health advocates. They will say, Aseem Malhotra is promoting junk science, for example. I've had lots of that over the years. When I raise the alarm bell about sugar, I had the sugar industry after me. There's all sorts of stuff going on, right? So I've experienced that. I know that myself. And recently we've seen the issue about the current narrative on COVID, lockdowns, even vaccines, dare I say it. There has been a suppression of free speech. There's only one narrative that's allowed. And of course, one of the ways that they do that, again, is through capturing social media, which I'll come on to, so that people are only getting one version of the truth. So 10 years ago, Gerard Hastings, who's one of the leaders in the tobacco control movement, actually wrote this paper in the BMJ, which is great, called Why Corporate... people were seeing what was happening and how society was going down the wrong direction. And it's called Why Corporate Power is a Public Health Priority. And he says in conclusion, he says, we, not me, we, all of us, as citizens, not consumers, as citizens, need to take the lead in a movement away from a world driven by abeyance to the corporate bottom line and the enrichment of an elite to one that prioritizes physical, mental, social, and planetary well-being. Okay, so let's just give you an example. So I remember Joe Rogan, who you might know on the left, is a very popular podcaster. I think he's the most popular podcast in the world. And on the right, we have John Abramson, Dr. John Abramson from Harvard, very eminent doctor. I published with him as well. And he's been involved over the years in litigation in many cases with the pharmaceutical industry when fraud has happened. And in this interview with Joe Rogan, I was pretty shocked, but I thought this is something that needs to be shared and thought about a little bit. He talks about the Vioxx scandal. So just to summarize, people may not be aware of this. In the late 90s, early 2000s, a drug was approved and marketed and consumed or taken up by swathes of the population in the US, Europe, called Vioxx. And Vioxx was seen at the time as a better alternative to ibuprofen as an anti-inflammatory painkiller. And it was marketed on the fact that it was as good as ibuprofen, but didn't give you the stomach side effects. Some of you may know if you have ibuprofen, empty stomach and all that kind of stuff, it leads to stomach ulcers and that kind of thing. That's how it was marketed. And in the end, after a few years, it was worked out because there were some things in the original trial in the paper that some clever scientists noticed that suggested it was going to increase heart attacks and strokes. And in the end, they were found guilty of fraud, and it was estimated, and John Abramson talks about this. He says that that it was estimated that probably about 60,000 American men were killed because of Vioxx. Sorry, not men, as in citizen people. 60,000 deaths from heart attack and stroke because of Vioxx. And he said that was the equivalent of the amount of soldiers that died in Vietnam. And it was taken up by about 200 million people, and it caused 60,000 deaths. Okay, fine, it could be a mistake, there's fraud, blah, blah, blah. And in the litigation, emails were exposed, as part of that litigation process. And one email, when the drug was being approved, not later on, when it was around the time it was being approved, was an email that was circulated from the chief scientist of Merck. And it said this: "It's a shame that the cardiovascular effect is there of Vioxx, but the drug will do well, and we will do well." What do you call that kind of behavior? Please feel free to shout out a word. Any?
Criminal.
Criminal? Anything else? Immoral. Yeah? Okay.